The wind scraped the mountains like a file. Snow lifted and fell in thin veils that turned the world into a breathing thing. Clara Monroe kept her face down and her eyes on her boots. Each step punched a dark hole in the drift and filled with the hiss of blown powder. The wool around her shoulders had frozen into plates. Her fingers were a clumsy ache. She drew the small bundle tighter to her chest and listened for what she wanted more than anything to hear. "Nothing, June," she said, lips stiff. The sound broke apart in the air. She tried again. "Stay with me, bird." The child's head lay against her, weightless and heavy at the same time. Frost clung to the ends of the girl's lashes. Her skin had the color of skimmed milk. Clara bent her face to the crown of that small head and tasted cold and salt. Every breath stung her teeth. The slope tilted. She lost her footing, slid on crusted ice, and dropped to one knee. Pain went through the joint like a nail. She pressed her palm into the snow. It burned, then went numb. Beyond the next roll of ground, the pines rose in a black line, all the needles chiming in the wind. Somewhere under that she saw it, a smear of smoke against gray sky, thin as writing, cabin smoke. Clara stood. The bundle in her arms shifted. She eased it up, felt for the little ribs through the blanket, and counted. 1, 2. She lied to herself because lies could be kind. Her boots squeaked. The air smelled of iron and sap. She walked. The cabin sat near the lip of a rock shelf, the granite dropping away into a white bowl of trees. A stack of wood leaned under an eave. The door had iron hinges and scars where weather had gnawed it. A rifle hung on pegs just inside the window where any passerby could see it. The smoke from the chimney came out steady. There was life here, or at least heat. Clara lifted her hand. Her knuckles did not want to bend. She knocked. The sound was small against the wind. She rested her forehead on the wood and let the cold pull at the warmth in her skin. She did not think of Dry Gulch. She did not think of the church bell or the looks. She thought of a creek at dusk and a song and a tongue that had no word for shame. The door opened. He filled the frame like a tree, a beard that had caught snow, a scar that crossed his temple and disappeared in his hair. The eyes were winter eyes, clear, tired, watchful. He did not speak. He took in the wool, the frost, the raw crack in her lower lip. He took in the bundle. Clara tried to shape the plea. Her mouth made the words as if they were a prayer she had learned wrong and never corrected. "Bury my girl." Something moved in his face, a shift that passed and left no trace. He held out both hands. She let go of the weight in her arms and felt a pain she had not braced for. He peeled back the edge of the gray blanket with his thumb. The child's mouth was blue at the corners. Her lashes glittered with ice. He set a finger beneath the tiny nose and waited. Then he put his ear to her chest. He closed his eyes. When he looked up, his voice came out quiet and quick. "She's not gone." He turned and stepped back, the door wide. Heat tumbled out and ran over Clara's face. The room was small and narrow, built from thick logs that had held back years of weather. Firelight shook across a stone hearth. A kettle let off a thin thread of steam. A dog with a gray muzzle lifted its head from the rug and watched without growling. Inside, the man said, "Close it." Clara stumbled across the threshold. The air made her cough. She shut the door and slid the iron bolt. Her hands shook so hard the metal rang. The dog stretched and came to stand in the line of draft big body, taking the edge off the cold that seeped from the sill. The man laid the bundle on a pallet near the fire and worked without speaking. He cut the blanket open with a small knife. He stripped wet wool from the girl's body and passed it back to Clara. Steam came off the fabric in the heat. He pressed his palm to the child's chest and counted. He did not nod. He did not frown. He lifted the kettle, poured hot water into a tin basin, and dropped a cloth into it. The cloth hung off his fingers like a limp fish and dripped back into the bowl. He wrung it and set it on the girl's neck. Another he laid across the soles of her feet. He set 2 stones into the coals and turned them with the poker until they were glossy with heat. He wrapped them in flannel and knotted the corners. He tucked them into the crooks of the girl's knees and under her armpits. He placed his mouth near hers and watched the small dent at the base of the throat. He listened. Clara knelt where she could see the child's face. The fire made light jump on the cheeks. She held the cut blanket and did not know what to do with her hands. She wanted to crush something. She wanted to lie down and let the sleep take her from the scalp down. "Is she breathing?" she asked. It was not a question. It was a wish. "A little," he said. He moved to a shelf and took down a clay bowl and a twist of dried leaves bound with cotton string. He crumbled a pinch and set a coal in the bowl. A small smoke rose white and clean. He waved it over the girl and watched the smoke break around her mouth and nose. He took a dark bottle and shook out a few drops onto a spoon. He touched the spoon to the girl's lips. She did not swallow. He rubbed the breastbone with 2 fingers, slow circles, then sharper taps. He picked up a goose quill hollow and cut on an angle and turned it in his hand. Clara flinched. "What is that?" "Help," he said. He met her eyes, hold her jaw. Clara slid her palm under her daughter's chin and felt the tiny hinge. The skin there was warm through the cloth. It felt like a lie and a miracle at once. The man tipped the child's head and eased the quill into her mouth. He did not push far. He shaped his breath and gave it in short, measured puffs. The air moved the wet hair at the girl's temple. After 3 breaths, he paused. He pressed his ear to the small chest again. He set a hand to the bones of the ribs and counted. The dog settled by the door. The kettle ticked. Snow scoured the logs and fell into quiet again. Clara's teeth chattered. The man glanced at her hands and then at the army blanket that hung from a peg by the hearth. "Wrap up," he said. She shook her head. "Wrap both of you." He pulled the blanket down and swung it around her shoulders. He was not gentle, but he was careful. He tucked the coarse wool around Clara and drew it over her lap and over the child. The heat made her skin prickle. She bit her lip to keep from making a sound. She leaned closer. She smelled pine pitch on his shirt and bitter bark on his fingers. He set his palm flat on the girl's chest and tapped time with his thumb. "In," he said. "Out." He kept his voice level and even as if talking would teach the lungs what to do. Clara listened. She found a note in the sound of the kettle and hummed it soft, close to the child's ear. A song from a riverbank. She did not sing the words. The words would have broken her. He checked the stones and turned them. He tied the flannel knots tighter and tucked them back. Knots held things: heat, hands, promises. He broke a sliver of willow bark and crushed it with the heel of his hand. He mixed it with a smear of honey on his thumb and touched the sweet to the girl's tongue. The tongue quivered. The throat bobbed once, twice. The man let out a breath that moved his beard. "What is your name?" he asked. "Clara." "Silas," he said. He did not offer a hand. His hands were busy. "How long in the storm?" 3 days if you count the nights." He nodded once. He could count the miles in her voice. He could count the hunger in her eyes. He looked at the girl again, and then set his gaze on the fire as if the flame itself needed to be watched or it would falter. He reached for the basin and changed the cloth. The new heat made steam curl up in a ribbon. The ribbon looked like breath. He watched it and then watched the child. Clara uncurled one hand and slid 2 fingers under the blanket to find the small foot. The skin there was warmer now. She closed her eyes and held that fact like a coal in a gloved palm. The cabin creaked. Outside, a tree cracked with the cold. The first cough sounded like a torn sheet. Clara jerked. The child's mouth opened and pulled in a thin mouthful of air and then let it out in a ghost of a cry. Another cough came harsher. Clara's chest broke in 2 and went back together again. She pressed her forehead to the girl's temple and laughed without sound. The man leaned back on his heels and set the quill aside. He wiped his brow with the back of his wrist and watched the skin of the child's face as color tried to find it. Then the heat came like a blush and did not stop. The girl's forehead grew hot under Clara's hand. The breath sped up and thinned. The small chest rose in short jerks. The eyes twitched beneath the lashes. The warmth that had been a blessing turned greedy. Silas kept his voice steady. "Stay with her," he said. He stood and reached for another bundle on the shelf. He did not take his eyes off the child. He spoke to the air and to the fire and to the small lungs that worked like bellows made for a smaller forge. "This is not finished." The kettle whistled. The dog lifted its head. Snow slid off the roof in a soft collapse. The room held its breath. "Breathe, June," Clara said. "Breathe." Silas looked at her, then at the girl. "This isn't over." The fever climbed. Heat ran beneath June's skin like a tide that refused to ebb. Silas stirred the coals until they glowed lemon and then banked them so they would last. Steam curled from the kettle, white and thin, turning in the draft. Clara kept her palm on her daughter's temple. The heat there scared her, yet it was proof that life had not fled. "Keep the cloths warm," Silas said. He changed the one at June's neck and the one at her arches. He did not raise his voice. He did not look away from the small chest that hitched under the wool. Clara moved because he told her to, and because moving kept her from breaking. She dipped a fresh cloth, wrung it with a strength she did not know she had, and set it where his hand left off. The heat kissed her fingers through the fabric. She flinched, then leaned into the sting. Rook settled near the door again, a body between the room and the cold. Silas crossed to a pegboard and took down a crooked mortar and pestle. He shaved a sliver of willow bark and ground it with steady turns. The smell was clean and bitter. He added a few elderberries from a paper twist, crushed them into a deep purple paste, then loosened it with a trickle of honey. He waited until the spoon warmed in his hand and then touched a bit of the dark sweetness to June's lip. "Come on," he said, the words a murmur to no one in particular. He stroked the breastbone with 2 fingers, small circles, then firmer. He watched for the swallow. There a twitch of the tongue, a small sound in the throat. He nodded once, a movement so slight Clara almost missed it. Clara found a song in her bones and let it out under her breath. No words, only a line that moved the way a river moves in late summer. June's lashes trembled and held a dust of ice that melted where they touched the warmth of her cheek. Clara brushed them with the corner of the blanket. Her hands shook less now. Silas poured water into a clay cup and let white sage smoke rise again. The smoke threaded over June's face and broke, then settled, then thinned. He set the cup aside and eased his weight back on his heels. He did not sit. He did not risk the softness of a chair. "Drink," Clara said to June, even though drinking was not yet possible. She said it to set the world in the right shape. Silas glanced at her. He did not correct her. He reached for a fresh strip of flannel and tied a new knot around a hot stone. "Knots hold heat," he said, as if answering a question she had not spoken. Clara looked at the knot and at his hands. The nails were split, the knuckles scarred the pads thick from work and winter. There was a dark smear near his wrist that was not dirt. It was an old stain, a memory ground into fabric. She pretended not to see it. He tucked the stone in at June's knees and another under her arm. "Tell me the town," he said without looking up. "Dry Gulch." He knew the name. She saw it cross his face and disappear. 3 days, he said. 3. They sent you out. They never let me in. He let that stand. He opened a low cupboard and took out a bundle that smelled of soil and mountains. He untied the string. Roots had been cleaned and dried and kept with care. He weighed them in his palm and chose one with ridges that looked like ribs. He cut a sliver, set it to soak, and returned to the fire. "What is that?" Clara asked. "Osha." He plucked another term. "Bear root. Will it help?" "It gives the lungs a hand." He set the cup by the hearth so the heat could coax its strength into the water. Clara leaned closer to June. The small chest rose and fell too fast. The skin at the throat went in and out with the work of it. Clara counted with her thumb where it pressed to the blanket. Her mouth was dry. Silas moved through the room as if he had rehearsed this walk for years. Shelf to hearth, hearth to basin, basin to pallet. He worked with care that had no softness in it. He checked June's nails, the bed's pale. He rubbed her feet until color returned. He pressed his ear to her chest. He kept his breath slow, as if a steady breath in him could teach a steady breath in her. Clara felt the edges of herself again. The shock began to thin. She stood long enough to peel off her own wet shawl and hang it where the steam would catch and do its work. The fabric gave a cold drip that sounded like a clock. She tucked the army blanket back around her lap and June's shoulders. She thought about the church in Dry Gulch and the way the hymns were sung without looking at the poor. She thought about the creek at dusk instead, where Tahoma had shown her a fish, no wider than her thumb, and laughed low when it slipped away. Silas watched June's face. "You have a song," he said. Clara nodded. "Keep it there, soft." She did. The line of melody would have been nothing in a loud room, but here it had a shape. It found a match in the small whistle of the kettle and the faint rasp of the fire. June's mouth opened enough to take a drop. She swallowed it. The swallow was a gift. Clara exhaled for the first time without feeling like a thief. He went to a wooden chest and lifted the lid. Inside lay a folded jacket, the color of old smoke, a small roll of leather tools, a packet of letters tied with string. Silas laid his hand on the jacket and did not move for a count of 3. Then he took out a narrow glass vial and a wrapped sachet. He closed the lid and set his palm flat on the top for a breath. He returned to the pallet with the things he had chosen, not the ones he had left. Clara watched his face as he moved. The set of his jaw had a history. He did not share it. He did not have to. The room told pieces of it without his help. A shelf of medical books thinned by years and weather, a comb with a broken tooth, a second mug clean on a hook. She did not ask who the mug had belonged to. He dipped the sachet and held it near June's nose. The smell was sharp and green and made Clara's eyes water. June's lips parted. A thin breath went in. Another. Not enough, but there. "How many people come here?" Clara asked, voice barely above the fire. "Not many." "And you help them?" "When they ask." "Why did you open the door?" "You knocked." Clara looked down. Her hands rested on the blanket, one on either side of June, as if she could keep the child from slipping out of the world by framing her in place. The blanket had a loose thread that she wound once around her finger. She tied it in a small knot and left it there. The day climbed without color. The window showed only white and the dark of the pines. Twice Silas stepped outside to fetch snow to melt. Both times Rook pressed into the space he left with patient gravity. Both times Clara listened to the sound of the wind combing the trees and wondered if that sound had been born before language. On his second return, Silas paused by the door. He bent and studied the floorboards. Then he scraped the boot heel marks clean and brought the snow to the kettle. Clara noticed the way he did not look at the window as he crossed the room. She noticed he had looked at the window a dozen times before that and said nothing. He offered Clara a tin cup of warm water. "Sip," he said. "Not for June, for you." She drank. The water felt like a curtain lifting off her tongue. She closed her eyes and let herself taste it. When she opened them, he was watching June again. The girl's breath had steadied a fraction. It was still too fast, but it was more sure. Clara put the cup down and touched her daughter's hair. The hair was damp at the temple and stuck to her fingers. "Thank you," she said without looking up. Silas did not answer. He packed the last of the sage into the clay bowl, blew the ember out, and set the bowl aside. He lifted June just enough to slide the flannel higher along her spine. He closed his eyes and put his ear to her back. He listened. He counted. He set her down and checked the knots again. A knot had loosened with the shift. He tightened it with a small pull and a twist. "Good," he said to no one. Clara let the song fall away and replaced it with the rhythm he had given her earlier. In and out. She spoke it so quietly, the sound barely left her mouth. June's breath found her voice and kept time with it for 3 counts. Then it went skittering fast again. Clara held steady. She did not beg. She did not pray. She sat with the heat and the fear and the work of staying. Silas cleaned the goose quill and laid it on a folded cloth. He wiped his hands on a towel that had seen better years. He went to the door and set the latch. He did not bar it, only set it. He came back to the fire and stood there for a moment with his hands on his hips as if bracing under an invisible weight. He looked older in that posture, and then younger when he moved again. By late afternoon, the world outside the window shifted from white to pale blue. The wind changed direction. It came from the ridge and carried a thin smell that did not belong to pine or smoke. Silas lifted his head and turned toward it. Clara felt it too, a sour curl of coal and grease, the ghost of a camp where camp did not belong. She did not speak it. She tucked the blanket tighter and smoothed June's hair. The girl opened her eyes to slits and then closed them, the lashes leaving a wet arc on her skin. The color in her cheeks had deepened to a faint rose. Clara leaned close to feel the breath with her own mouth. It was there, light and stubborn. Silas went to the door again and pulled it open a hand's width. The cold found the room and ran into his chest. He stood in the crack and listened. The sky over the ridge had taken on that bruised shade that means the day will give up soon. He looked down at the snow near the stoop. He crouched and touched a mark with 2 fingers. A half-moon of iron had pressed into the crust and left a clean edge. He closed the door and set the latch. He stood for a beat with his hand on the wood. He turned back to the fire with a face that had new lines. Clara did not ask. She did not need the shape of the word to know the shape of the thing. She drew June closer into the fold of the blanket. Rook lifted his head and showed the white of one eye. The room took the sound of the wind and swallowed it. The kettle ticked. The coals settled with a soft hiss. From far down the draw, a single hoof struck frozen ground and carried. Then another. Then silence. By full dark, the wind had dropped and the cold settled like glass. The hoof beats did not come again. Only the slow tick of cooling wood and the soft rasp of the fire filled the room. June's breath held to its thin rhythm too fast, but true enough for the moment. Clara kept the cloths warm and traded them when Silas nodded. Her hands had the memory now how long to wring, where to set, when to lift. Rook slept by the door with one ear turned a gray sentry in the draft. Silas watched the girl's face and the rise of her chest. He waited for the small swallow after a drop of elderberry honey and did not speak until he had seen it. When he finally straightened, he stepped back from the pallet, slow and careful as if the air might break. "Keep your song," he said. Clara found the line again. It sat low in her throat, a hum pressed close to June's ear. The child stirred and then eased. Clara let a breath go, then another. The kettle had stopped its thread of steam and needed tending. Silas lifted the lid and fed the coals with a careful hand. The flame climbed in a soft blue edge before settling back into orange. Heat moved into the room and took the bite out of Clara's fingers. Silas stood with his hand on the mantel. The bones in his wrist made a right angle under the skin. The frayed cloth tied there had a faint stitch of leaves running along its edge, green once now the color of dust. He looked at it for a long beat, then untied it and rolled it into his palm. He crossed to the wooden chest and lifted the lid. The hinges gave a small groan. Inside lay a jacket folded in on itself, letters bound with string gone to fray a narrow pouch of deer hide. He touched each thing with a steadiness that felt like ceremony. He took the pouch and set it on the table. He did not open it right away. He stood the pouch between his hands and looked at the girl in the firelight and at the woman bent over her. Clara sensed the turn in the room before she saw what he held. She kept her hum and raised her eyes. Silas loosened the rawhide tie and tipped the pouch into his palm. A single silver earring slid out small feathers worked in metal, a bead of turquoise that caught the light and held it. He turned it once between forefinger and thumb. The stone picked up the orange of the fire and flashed a warm green. "She gave me this on a night with snow on the ground and no wind," he said. His voice stayed low. "She wore the other when we were married." Clara did not speak. She saw how he did not blink when he said we were married, and how his hand did not shake when he held the metal. She saw something close inside him, and then open again. "I kept it because I could not keep her," he said. He stepped to the pallet and held the earring out. He did not offer it like a bargain. He offered it like a hand held steady over water. "For you," he said, "for here." Clara looked at the silver and then at the baby's softness still clinging at the edge of June's ears. She thought of the river song and the way Tahoma had shown her the names of plants with his hands. She thought of how words from Dry Gulch had burned and how this room had not used words as weapons. She did not take the earring. She asked a question with her eyes that she could not find a shape for in her mouth. Silas understood enough. "Not for her," he said, and then corrected himself with a nod toward June. "Not to bind her to a past that hurt, to mark a place that saves." Clara reached and accepted the weight of the silver. It lay cool in her palm. She did not put it in her ear. She looked at the frayed cloth in Silas's other hand and saw the stitch of leaves. With a small motion, she asked with her fingers, and he passed the cloth without a word. She pulled a single thread loose from the edge, thin and strong, and tied the earring to the leather cord around June's neck, the one that held a small bear carved from root. Her knot was sure. She set the tied charm flat against the child's chest where it could warm. Knots hold heat. Knots hold. Silas exhaled once, not relief and not sorrow. Something in between. He set the rest of the cloth on the table and left it there. His hands were empty now. He stepped into his coat and nodded at the back door that opened to the lean side of the cabin where the snow drifted. "I need a circle," he said. "If the thaw comes, the water must know where to go." Clara did not want him out of the room. She also knew what a circle meant. It meant keeping the inside dry and the fire safe. "Go," she said. "I have her." Rook rose. The dog looked at Silas and then at Clara, and then planted himself again by the door as if to say both were watched. Silas took a spade from the corner and eased the back door open. Cold slid in along the floor and curled the edges of the rugs. He went out into it and shut the door behind him. Clara tucked the army blanket up under June's chin. The girl's breath skittered and then found the thread again. Clara followed it with her voice. Steam gathered on the kettle lid and shook. She wiped it with the hem of her dress and set the cloth back by the fire to dry. Through the wall came the sound of a spade biting frozen ground, a chip of ice-scraped stone. Silas worked with a rhythm that made sense to a body. Lift, set, press, break, pull. The scrape of steel on soil had its own music. He was not far. He went the length of the wall and then the short side and back again. The circle would be shallow at first, then deep where the runoff would want to run. He was drawing a place for water to choose and then to keep that choice. Clara stood and went to the shelf. She found the clay bowl and blew a thin line of ash from its rim. The sage was spent. She left the bowl empty and set it on the hearth to be warm. She looked at the books on the shelf with their spines cracked and their titles half gone. She saw in the corner a small whittled horse, and new hands had made it for no practical reason except to make it. The room said the man had tried to leave a life, and had not managed it all the way. The back door opened and closed. Silas stamped snow from his boots just inside the sill and stood with his breath turning to steam in the room for a count of 3 before the heat took it. He leaned the spade by the door. His gloves were stiff with cold. He stripped them and laid them near the hearth. "Better," he said, and it was not a claim. It was a report. Clara nodded. She saw his knuckles cracked and red where the cold had bitten. She rose with the flannel and wrapped one hand and then the other, not tight, just a cover to take the sting. He let her. His hands were rough and heavy, and still careful when they moved to the pallet. June stirred. Her eyes flickered under lashes that had melted the last of their frost. The small line between her brows eased, then pinched, then eased again. The earring lay warm against her chest, the turquoise dull now where it touched skin. Clara set 2 fingers lightly on the charm, as if to make sure it existed and had not been only a wish. Silas squinted toward the window. The sky outside held a thin smear of light low on the ridge. He went to the front door and set his palm to the wood. He listened. The sound came again, faint and far, not wind, metal on stone, the kind of clank that comes when a stirrup kisses rock. He did not reach for the rifle. He reached for the latch and checked it, then let his hand fall. He looked around the room and moved the chair so that it did not face the door head-on. He set the kettle so the steam ran along the wall instead of up the window where it might have flashed a signal. Clara watched him. "Riders," she said. He looked at her and did not answer because there was nothing useful to say. He went to the pallet and slid June a hand's width farther from the door. He took the bare root infusion off the hearth and cooled it with a bit of snow melted in his palm. He held the cup where the warmth could reach the nose without burning. June's mouth opened and took a breath that tasted of herbs and hot stone. The room returned to its quiet, but a different quiet, the kind that pays attention. Rook stood and went to the door and pressed his shoulder to the wood and stayed there breathing slow. The fire gave up a low crack and sent a small fan of sparks up the throat of the chimney. The scent of pitch and ash settled like a blanket below the rafters. Silas glanced at the flannel knots. He tightened one that had taken slack. He checked the stones and turned them with the poker so their heat would last. He set his palm on June's chest and felt the push of breath against his skin. He closed his eyes and nodded. He took his hand away and stood. A sound came from the ridgeline then. Not many. 5 maybe. The snow carried it like a wire carries a hum. It came closer and then paused. Leather creaked. A bit clinked. A horse snorted a quick cloud of white and then nothing. Clara could picture where they sat because she had seen men sit like that at the edge of fields under other skies. Waiting has a certain weight that shows itself even when you cannot see it. Silas set his palm flat on the door and left it there. He breathed once slow. He put his other hand on the table and the frayed cloth under his fingers. He did not pick it up. He did not put it away. He let it sit between his hand and the wood and kept his eyes on the door. Knuckles rapped the plank. Once. Then twice, a third time harder. A voice with prayer house polish and something sour in it slid through the crack around the frame. "Open up, Mountain Rat." Silas kept his hand on the door. The wood was cold and a little damp. He set his voice so it would carry without sounding like fear. "There is a sick child," he said. "You will not cross this door." A laugh came back with church polish on it. "You do not give orders to Dry Gulch Hart. Open up." Clara rose with June in her arms. The blanket slid and caught on her elbow. Rook stood with his shoulder pressed to the plank and his head low. The room held the sound of their breath and the fire. Outside, leather creaked. A horse shifted and stamped. The smell of men and cold iron crowded under the sill. Silas lifted the bar and set it aside. He did not swing the door wide. He opened it a hand's width and stood in the gap. The light from the hearth fell in a narrow blade across snow. Gideon Pike sat his horse as if he had been born to it. 4 men behind him wore the kind of faces that look at work as something for other people. Gideon leaned cheek hollow in the cold. "Step aside." Silas did not move. He made his body a hinge that would not give. "Turn around." Gideon smiled without warmth. His eyes went past Silas and into the room. "She is here then, the woman who forgot her place." Silas felt the shift happen and chose not to watch it come. He pushed the door towards shut. The butt of a rifle struck the plank. The blow ran through the wood and into Silas's shoulder. He rocked back. The door flew open. Men came in with the weather on them. Rook barked once and planted his feet. One of the men kicked at the dog and missed boot heel skidding on the mat. Silas took the first hit to the jaw, a blind swing that lit up his vision. He went down to one knee and tasted copper. "Stop," Clara said, voice flat. She had June in her arms and was already moving for the stove. The small square of floor that lifted on a hinge sat flush with the boards. She put her foot under the edge and pried it up. The cellar breathed up the chill of earth and potatoes. Gideon took 2 steps into the room as if it belonged to him. He reached for Clara. She pivoted and slipped, but her hand found the rim of the hatch. She lowered June as if the air were made of glass. "Quiet," she said into the dark. Not a sound. June's face turned toward the heat of Clara's voice. The girl's breath fluttered fast. Clara pulled a burlap sack into the opening and softened the edge with an old quilt. She set the hatch down until only a finger's worth of light remained. She pressed her palm to the board and then let it close. The iron ring fell flat with a soft clap. A fist closed on Clara's wrist. Gideon's grip was hard and full of practice. He yanked her around. The blanket tore where it had frozen. His breath smelled like whiskey and pride. "You made a fool of me once," he said. "You will not get the chance again." Clara looked him in the eye. "I did not make you," she said, "and I will not be yours." The man to Silas's left drove a knee into his ribs. The world narrowed. Silas caught the edge of the table and used it to rise. Another hit found the side of his head. He saw the plank floor tilt and settle. Hands grabbed his arms. A loop of rawhide went around his wrists and pulled tight. He did not fight the knot. He knew knots. He felt how this one had been tied fast with more anger than skill. Rook lunged. A stock cracked down across the dog's shoulder. Rook skidded and rose again with a growl that sat deep in his chest. "Leave him," Silas said. His voice cut through in a way that sounded like someone who does not waste words. Gideon shoved Clara toward the door. "Outside," he said. "The town wants to see what passes for a home up here." "You do not bring Dry Gulch to my threshold," Silas said. "You do not bring your sermon into my fire." Gideon's smile widened. "Look at you, preaching." The man behind Silas jerked the rawhide, and pain flared in his wrists. Silas let his body slump as if the fight had gone out of him. He let them pull him toward the corner where the firelight died and the shadows began. He kept his eyes on Clara long enough to see the muscle jump in her jaw and the way her hand opened and closed once, as if finding a rope in empty air. On the mantel sat a strip of old metal he had pried from a broken trap months back. He had set it there to remind himself to mend what he could, and to throw away what could not be mended. The strip had an edge like a stubborn idea. As the men dragged him, Silas let his body fall into the wall and slide. His back hit the baseboard. His bound hands landed where the strip rested. He turned his wrists and felt the first sting of a cut. Clara drew herself up. Gideon raised his hand. She slapped him hard. The sound was sharp in the warm room. One of the men laughed, then choked on it when Silas's shoulder drove into his knees. The rawhide bit deeper. The metal strip shaved through a layer of hide. The knot held. Silas did not panic. He let the edge work on the place where rope remembers softness. Gideon swung for Clara again. She skipped back and ran straight into the lean side door. The latch gave. Cold came in. She grabbed the first thing her hand found, a bucket with ash and cinder from the last clean-out. She held it like a threat. The man nearest her hesitated because a face full of ash is a thing even a bold man does not want. Silas twisted his wrists. The cord nicked and gave a little. He hid the motion with a groan and a drop of his head. He counted a breath. He pulled. The rawhide split with a sound that only he heard. "Enough," Gideon said. He pointed at the hatch near the stove. "Open that." "No," Clara said. Gideon reached for the latch himself. Silas came up from the floor like a spring. He put his shoulder into Gideon's ribs and drove him into the table. The table skittered and dumped the kettle. Steam and boiling water splashed wide and caught one man across the wrist. He yelped and dropped his rifle. The gun hit the planks and lay there heavy and sure as iron tends to do when men forget they are not gods. Silas grabbed the rifle first. He did not aim at a man. He stepped to the door and fired into the sky. The shot cracked the ridge. Snow slid off the roof in a white sheet and landed with a muffled thud. Birds lifted from the dark trees in a ragged cloud. The men flinched because even brave men jump when the world shouts that loud. "Get out," Silas said. His voice was calm. Calm is more frightening than a shout when a man holds a gun. One of the riders backed into the yard and put his hands up in a shape that meant he did not want to win that day. Another cursed and went for Silas with his head down like a bull. Silas let him come. He stepped aside and used the rifle like a staff. The stock met bone. The man went face first into the drift. He stayed there with the snow in his mouth and thought about choices. Gideon clawed for his boot knife. He came at Silas with it held wrong. Clara moved on instinct. She threw the bucket. Ash covered Gideon's face and hair. He swore and swung blind. The knife cut air. Rook hit him low. The dog's weight took his legs. Gideon went down in a clatter of spurs and prayer words turned ugly. At the edge of the yard, a lantern swung from a saddle horn. A frightened hand grabbed it and flung. The lantern arced and broke against the lean-to, where the chopped wood had been stacked dry as a book. Light ran up the boards with a greed that had waited weeks for a chance. Clara saw it first. She turned and was already moving. She seized the water bucket that had not spilled and threw. It hissed and turned the edge black. The fire climbed anyway. Smoke rolled along the eaves and smudged itself under the rafters in the room. June coughed under the floor, a small sound, but it carried through wood like a bird beating its wings in a box. Silas heard it, and felt something in him shift into a single line. He kicked Gideon's knife away and put his forearm across Gideon's throat. He could have pressed and been done. He did not. He set the rifle down and grabbed the other man by the coat and heaved him into his own rider. Both slammed into the yard post and stayed there. "Listen," Silas said to Gideon, soft and cold. "This is my house. This is my family. If you come again, the mountain keeps you." Gideon spat black phlegm. It hung on his lip and swung. There was no sermon in him now, only anger and the kind of shame that curdles. He glared at Clara. He got nothing from her face. He shoved to his feet and stumbled for his horse. The others found their reins with hands that had learned speed. Snow took the sound of hooves and made it small. Silas turned to the lean-to. The flames had found the pitch in the boards and climbed. He grabbed a blanket and plunged it into the snow and hauled it up soaked and heavy. He slapped it against the flames. Clara joined him with the ash bucket and another slop of water hauled from the snowbank in a pot. Steam billowed, sparks snapped, smoke climbed the inside wall and then thinned as the blanket stole the air the fire needed. Rook stood between them and the open door and watched both at once, eyes bright in the dark. The dog's shoulder twitched with pain where the stock had struck. He set his weight so no one could drag him from his post. The last of the flame went to black. Smoke hung in a gray ribbon and then unraveled. The lean-to was not gone. It was hurt. The back wall of the cabin wore a new char, a bruise that would not wash out. The air tasted like a camp that has outstayed its welcome. Silas dropped the blanket and bent at the waist with his hands on his knees. He breathed hard once, then twice, then straightened. Clara went to the hatch and lifted it. The cellar exhaled cool and damp. June's eyes gleamed in the low light. She coughed a small rasp that still carried fear. Clara reached down and lifted her out the blanket, trailing like a shadow. She held the girl and touched her cheek with the back of her knuckles. The skin was hot, but the breath was there. In, out. Silas crossed to them. He smelled of smoke and sap and iron. His hair had a smear of ash through it, gray on gray. Blood made a thin line down from his temple into his beard. He did not touch the child. His hands had held too many rough things in the last 5 minutes. He met Clara's eyes, and something in his face let go of a rope he had held a long time. Rook came and leaned his head into Clara's hip. June lifted a hand and let it fall onto the dog's neck. Her fingers settled there and did not slip. Silas looked at the table where the kettle had fallen. He put it back on the hook and set the coals right. He worked because work sets the floor under your feet. The room took back its shape as firelight found stone and log and the curve of a clay bowl. He went to the table where the frayed cloth lay. He picked it up and held it a moment. The stitch of leaves ran along the edge, faint and stubborn. He turned to Clara and set the folded square in her hand. "I can let it go," he said, "if you will stay." Clara closed her fingers around the cloth. She did not answer. June coughed again, a quick bark of air that left her eyes bright with water. Snow slid off the roof in a slow, soft sheet and thudded into the drift by the door. The room breathed. The smoke thinned. The dog lifted his head and listened to the quiet. 12 winters slid past like sheets of light on the river. Snow still came heavy to the San Juans, but the cabin stood with its back straight. The trench ran true around the foundation and carried melt where it needed to go. Fence posts held their line. Rope knots sat neat on their rails, weathered smooth by wind and hand. Morning arrived clean and cold. Breath rose from the horses in the lower meadow. A thread of smoke climbed from the chimney and spread thin under the pale sun. The smell in the yard mixed pine pitch and boiled linen and a little iron from the anvil stone by the woodpile. June crossed the edge of the timber with a pouch at her hip and a small knife in her palm. She moved quiet. Her boots did not break the crust. She touched the plant she wanted before she cut it 2 fingers to the stem the way Silas had shown her, and spoke a word that belonged to the people who named the valley before maps. Osha root gave up a sliver with a clean sound. She wiped the knife and tucked the root in her pouch. Elder flower cones rattled in the wind and sprinkled a faint sweetness. Her lips found a tune made of 4 notes. The tune pulled the trees closer. Closer to the cabin, a buckboard waded in the track that led down to Dry Gulch. Frost laced the spokes. On the stoop, a broom leaned bristles trimmed square. The dog that slept on the warm planks woke and thumped its tail once then twice and put its chin back down on white paws. The muzzle had gone all frost a long time ago. Rook lifted one ear at the step that always creaked, then let it fall when the step stayed quiet. Inside, heat sat in the room without glare. The fire worked low and competent. Clara Monroe had her hair in 2 short braids tied with rawhide. She sat with a leather journal open and a stub of pencil between her fingers. The page took notes in a hand that had learned how to save space without losing the shape of things. She wrote cough and fever and willow. She paused and listened to the sound of water against iron and corrected the dose by a drop. Silas Hart wrapped a bandage for a Shoshone elder who had come up the track with a wrist that had not liked to fall. The old man's hair was white to the shoulder. He wore a shirt with beaded cuffs under a coat he had traded for somewhere down the valley. He watched Silas work and nodded once when the last turn of cloth lay flat and held. "Good," the elder said. "It will remember where to sit now." "It will," Silas said. He tucked the end through and pressed with his thumb. "Come back if the swelling talks too much." The old man laughed in his chest. He rose slow and easy. Clara poured tea and set the cup where it would not crowd him. He took it with a small bow and a word that held thanks and a wish for warmth. Rook pushed his nose into the man's hand and got a scratch in return. June came in with the cold behind her and closed the door with the back of her heel. She set the pouch on the table and spilled out root and flour and a bit of moss she liked to smell because it held shade. The elder greeted her in words that fit like old boots. She answered with care and got a smile that made her stand taller by a little. The man went. Silas saw him to the stoop and watched him take the buckboard track until snowblow hid the wheels. He stood with his hands on his hips and felt for the weather in his chest. The air would hold. He came back in and took the kettle off the hook. He tilted it and skimmed the bloom that forms if you leave a fire to speak too long with water. June sank onto the bench with a sigh that belonged to work done right. "Bare root," she said, "and a little elder, enough for 2 batches. The creek path is clear. I marked the slough with twine." Silas nodded. He looked at the twine around her wrist. The knot sat small and true. "You tied that." "Square knot," she said. "It listens." Clara wrote the word square in the margin and drew a tiny box with an X through it. She closed the journal and set her hand on the cover as if to hold the words in. She looked up and caught Silas watching the steam curl off the kettle. The curl looked like breath when it leaves a sleeping child. He saw it too. His mouth smiled without showing teeth. He set the kettle back. "Fence line near the aspen needs a hand," he said. "I will bring twine," June said. Rook lifted his head and watched the 2 of them shape their morning without hurry. He shifted and gave the quiet rumble that old dogs use for contentment. The room kept his sound the way it kept heat. They worked. The fence post took the new rope and held. Silas set the rails and checked the lean. June threaded twine and kept it from snagging. She took the slack and made a hitch that would not slip. Clara brought out a plate of bread that had kept heat under a cloth and a jar of plum preserves that would taste like summer for 5 minutes. They ate standing by the fence with breath showing and sugar pushed to the edges of their mouths. A sled track curved down from a neighbor's place on the far benchland. The track brought a woman and a child. The child had a cough he could not hide. The woman's scarf had a tear that had been mended with neat darning. They had the look of people who use a whole day like a coin that buys half of what you need and none of what you want. Clara waved them in. June sorted root by thickness. Silas set water to warm and laid clean cloth on the table. The cabin took on the smell of willow and elder, and the green sharp of sage revived. The child's cough changed by a hair after the first steam. He learned the rhythm of in and out from the way Silas spoke it. The woman's shoulders softened. She left with a bundle of dried plant and instructions that would fit into a morning and not break it. When the yard fell quiet again, light had swung past noon and softened into that good winter yellow. Silas wiped the table and stacked the bowls. He put a hand to the notch in the doorframe where Gideon's rifle butt had left its mark long ago. His thumb found the smooth. A groove that had nothing to do with shame lived there now. It felt like part of the cabin and not a wound. "Come," he said to June when the light thinned. "Bring your knife." They walked into the trees behind the house and followed the line where the trench met the slope and disappeared. Snow hushed even the small sounds. The air tasted of iron and sun. Rook came 2 steps behind and chose a spot to sit when the climb began. He watched with a settled eye. Silas found the pine he wanted by touch more than by sight. A scar ran down one side where lightning had kissed it and moved on. The bark lifted in plates. Resin had hardened in amber beads and smelled like clean fire when you broke one. He laid his hand on the trunk. "Here," he said. June stood close and looked up. "What will you write?" Silas took the knife and set the point to the bark. He worked slow. He cut clean and shallow. Curled bits fell and landed on the snow and looked like dark fish in a white river. He leaned back, read what he had made, and cut one more line to make the letters true. June stepped in and read it where the sap had begun to shine in the cuts. Her voice made the words part of the air. "She's still breathing, and so am I." She touched the letters with 2 fingers. The wood under her skin felt warm where the sun had found it. She looked at him. "We keep it," Silas said. "We keep it," she answered. They stood in that small clearing and listened. No metal on stone, no leather on wood. Far off the church bell from Dry Gulch came thin and late, and not for them. The sound rose and fell and had no bite. It faded and left the cold quiet behind. Back at the cabin, Clara stirred a pot that smelled like meat and thyme and remembered hands. She lifted the lid and let the steam bathe her face. A strand of hair stuck to her cheek. She brushed it back and tied it with a bit of twine she took from around her wrist. The knot held on the second pull. A strip of cloth with faded leaves lay folded by the window where the sun had reached it. She set her palm on it and left it there for a count of 3. June put the herbs on the table and hung her coat on the peg with the smooth spot where her hand had met it 100 times. She went to the hearth and checked the stones by instinct. She turned one with the poker and watched the coals lick it. She smiled at the clean trick of heat held and released. She placed the carved bear and the silver earring on the mantel while she washed. The turquoise had gone soft with years of touch. It took light and kept it for a breath and then gave it back. Silas came in last. He closed the door and set the latch. He looked at the faces in the room and felt a lightness in his bones that owed nothing to weather. He took a board and a hammer and mended the small gap near the stove where the last freeze had pulled a seam open. The sound of the hammer struck and softened and died against the logs. When he was done, he set the hammer aside with care. He stood and let the warmth climb his hands. They ate. They passed bread. They did not say grace out loud. The room knew what had been asked and what had been given. After Clara took her journal and wrote a line while the others listened to the fire. June stretched on the rug with a book whose spine was tired and loved. Rook put his head on her ankle and slept with the peace of a creature that has chosen its watch and kept it. Later, Silas took his knife to a piece of soft pine and began to shape it. The blade whispered. The wood shed curls that smelled like sun. A wolf took form under his thumb and moved toward the place where a tail learns how to curve. He set the figure on the mantel beside the bear and the earring. The 3 made a small story of teeth and grace and the shine a stone can hold. Night closed its hand over the ridge. Snow began again, thin at first, then steadier. It brushed the window with a sound like sand on silk. The fire laid down, not tired, just thoughtful. Breath rose from the 3 of them and blended in the warm air. The kettle showed its thin thread and kept it. The pine on the slope held its new letters. The cuts darkened and then filled with a cleaner color. Sap sealed the edges. Wind moved through the needles and made a sound like a long, slow answer. Snow fell through it all and softened the ground and touched the roof and laid itself quiet along the fence. It did not hide the path to the door. It found the trench and walked with it. It took the shape the hands had made. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.